I left 8 months ago to see the world and to make a difference, thinking change could happen fast in places that need it most. I wanted to study the issues plaguing some of the poorest in the world, thinking of poverty traps and the need for better education, healthcare, communication, and aid money. I came from a wealthy, small, white community and felt my good fortune was a means to help the global population, people I'd never seen before but assumed needed assistance. And yet, as I gazed back at the moments of the trip that impacted me the most, they were the stories in which I played observer. They were moments I merely witnessed or stood aside for, watching people and communities experience social injustices. I never considered injustice to be a limiting role in development, thinking that people could get past the inequalities and obstacles put against them with effort and dedication. This was up until I explicitly confronted the issues, put faces to the prejudices, and began to realize my active role in this world's ongoing list of inequities. It was through traveling the world and witnessing poverty, crime, classism, and gender discrimination that I realized I was most affected by the instances of social injustice. I began to see these discrepancies and differences in opportunities, lifestyles, and emotional and mental well-being in the communities we visited in India. Apparent to me now were the stratifications of occupation and economic prosperity, perhaps remnants of the caste system. Struggling with this cultural disparity, as well as our definitions of empowerment and equality in a society with strict gender roles, called me to question the society I myself come from. I was pointing fingers at some of the indecencies toward women in India, and what I thought to be keeping them in limiting roles. Yet with our flying colors of freedom and equality, we still can't carry out the Equal Pay Act to its full extent. And for those women who do succeed, they've just learned how to adhere to male expectations in a world created by and for men. In a country that claims to value liberty, we've never been able to enact an Equal Rights Amendment. So how just is the U.S.? On one occasion, seated on a crowded bus in India, I observed as a young woman got on, standing in the doorway as we pulled away. Lost to me in the Hindi words exchanged, the situation quickly escalated. The men were angry and wanted her to move or get off, but she raised her voice, standing her ground. The incident still leaves me confused and pondering whether the men were upset because she wouldn't move from the door to the back, or more likely if she was too poor to pay her fare. Whatever the reason, she in no way deserved this dehumanizing treatment. It was the fundamental disrespect and cruelty directed at this person that bothered me so much. The fact that she was not welcome, yelled at, and left to walk in the trailing dust. I had never before confronted these inequalities in my own life, as I was doing now, putting real-life faces to the injustices I had only heard of. When Claire and I moved into our home in India, we were immediately greeted by the servant of the Gupta family. Fairly common amongst the upper middle-class families of Jaipur, Anil made our meals, opened doors for us, and did the family's chores. We thought he came early and went home at night after cooking and cleaning, but on New Year's Eve he opened the door for us at 2:30 a.m., his makeshift bed of couch pillows haphazardly placed beneath the TV and in front of the kitchen, with just a thin blanket atop, while I had 2 blankets and a mattress. It wasn't that being a servant in India is a dehumanizing job, because truthfully it is a much more desirable occupation than many others, but I felt most guilty in reflecting on myself. I have a family to go home to, and he has a family to serve, and while I didn't appreciate seeing him in what I thought to be an inferior role, it made me realize that there are many people closer to home who also play similar roles, in field work, in domestic help, and in caregiving. Yet I've never so much as cast a glance or considered the value we place on these types of jobs. Such economic disparities occur all over. I've just been neglectful and never taken the time to reflect on my role in perpetuating this. Early on, we read a book in Costa Rica called Savages, which drew our attention to the indigenous tribes of the Amazon in Ecuador. Not only was I unaware that there are people still living in this world so isolated from communication and globalization, but that they wish to remain so detached and persistently fight a battle to stay on their territory. But since oil companies have come into the rich lands of the rainforest, populations have been displaced, sovereignty infringed upon, land deforested, and rivers polluted. On our independent student travel weekend in Ecuador, We met a man who talked with us for hours about his personal story of preventing such atrocities. He was among the many indigenous peoples fighting for their homes deep within the Amazon, and he had made it to Tena to gain support for his cause. I felt guilty that I couldn't do more for him, that it was an American company he was fighting, a company that I myself supported at the pump. I guess I never really put a face to the consequences of our personal actions, the choices we take for granted and make every day. While we reap the benefits of energy and gas, others are put out of a home and off their land forever. At the moment, the indigenous tribe of the Waorani and several others are still in a huge lawsuit with Chevron for the repayment of damages from environmental destruction done by drilling. We learned during our visit to Amazon Watch in D.C. that after 18 years, nothing has been solved, and still, the Waorani haven't seen deserved justice. What hit me hardest was our time in South Africa, when we were exposed to the vicious and atrocious crimes of rape and a mob murder, things I'd only been aware to before in movies, and yet it was here, in the very township I was working in. The worst part was that we had heard similar stories in the weeks leading up and in those following, and while I was so appalled and scared, an act like this for these communities was mundane. I know you can get used to anything if you've lived with it long enough, but murders? How is this right? It occurred in the township of Kwanakatula, where I went to work with my caregiver every day, visiting her patients and greeting friendly faces on the street. It saddened me to pass by these informal housing communities on the way to the right neighborhoods in the big, empty beachfront homes. Here in these highly concentrated, government-issued homes, people lived and thrived and truly loved life, but regrettably grew desensitized to some of the world's greatest hardships. The lasting mark of apartheid left the black and colored people of South Africa living in these townships on the outskirts of white communities, away from city centers, proper nutrition, hospitals, and good schooling. They now have clinics, schools, a small police force, and a community center, but the health conditions of high blood pressure, high blood sugar, diabetes, and HIV remain a top concern present in many of the community's members. And still, amidst these social issues, I couldn't fathom how something so awful could happen here, to further add to these problems. How could a stepfather rape and murder his own daughter? And how could a community feel their only means of justice were to resort to mob force, to seek this man out and reciprocate his brutal act in another murder, 2,000 strong? They took to the streets unanimously, it seemed, for any opposing voice to question this act probably would have been killed as well. The familiar smell of burnt tires filled the air, and police merely stood by to see if anything got out of hand. And all of this occurring in the Rainbow Nation, one that had trumped apartheid, violence, and hatred. I had to wonder how far things had really come. We visited these townships in the morning, observed the living conditions and health concerns, and then saw the white beachgoers celebrate their holidays just down the road. We asked some of the graduating partygoers if they knew anyone with HIV or AIDS, and they looked at us inquisitively, most saying, "Of course not," as if it were a strange question. I was angered. How is there still so much racial and socioeconomic segregation? South Africa is a small country and possesses the most HIV infections in the world. How is it that they don't know anyone? They must not care, must not be aware. But am I any different? Before TBB, was I aware of HIV in my own community or in the United States? Do I know anyone with HIV? No. What is it that separates us? Is it money or safety? Social injustices manifest in a variety of ways, and perhaps in this one township, for this particular man and his surrounding community, it was society's sluggish movement toward racial equality that prompted this incident. The issues of living standards, well-being, nutrition, and healthcare haven't been fully addressed in the transition from apartheid, and certainly can't be solved in isolation. I had already had some time in India and South Africa to reflect a bit on the United States and to what extent women and racial differences needed to be addressed. But reading the book, There Are No Children Here, a story set in Chicago following two young black boys in the projects, again brought up the question of racism and justice in the United States, a blemish we certainly haven't overcome. How could this book be describing situations not unlike those I had seen in South Africa, where government housing was forgotten about and the people lived in highly concentrated skyrises, fearing for their lives and growing callous to the brutalities of murder and rape. In America, where I've lived for 18 years, honestly believing it to be modern and democratic in every way. I had a hard time grasping that the way I live, safe and sheltered, with plenty of options for education, health care, grocery stores, and friends, is not the norm for many other kids growing up in this same progressive country. How is it that still today people lead lives with setbacks and societal barriers simply because of where they were born? We've come so far in many ways, yet the lavish lives some lead are contingent upon the squalor of others. I had left home wanting to make a change in the world, but found myself unnerved by the human capacity to inflict suffering, discrimination, and structural violence against others. I came to see that the poverty, poor education, and nutrition I wanted to solve all stemmed from deeper social injustices. Superficial superiorities such as the color of skin or where we are born more often than not infringe on the very rights all humans deserve. A profound change in awareness must come from the world as a whole, as it is everyone's collective responsibility to address these injustices, to treat all as humans. I've come to think about my role and its ripple effect on the lives of others, to consider the Waorani man in his home when filling up my gas tank, to reflect on where I live and the stratified classes of the United States, and to recognize that prejudices toward women are still pervasive today. This trip has been a learning process in realizing and confronting these injustices, the first step giving me awareness to better inform my choices and decisions. And yet I stand not knowing what the next step of the journey is for me, or where my next move is, but understanding that not having the answer right now is not limiting. I know where I stand, and where all people should stand, and can no longer turn a blind eye to the indecencies this world has so bluntly showed me. Perhaps my next step starts with more questions rather than immediate action. I found it's no longer whether or not to make a change, but how I can make that change. I know I can make a difference in this world, but it's in first asking the right questions that lead to the solutions this world so desperately needs.